Well, I know.
It's real now.
Well, we're going to start and continue our study and finish our study in the book of Amos. And so we've been going through the last 2 weeks and looking at Amos's message to Israel and to the surrounding nations, even as a Judean and as he goes in. Is there anything that has stuck out to you so far as the main message of Amos, or if you had to sum up what Amos is trying to tell Israel, what he's communicating to them? It can be hard to kind of nail down the specifics because it does feel like it's gone through so many different things. And I'm hoping tonight, as we get started with chapter 7 and as we read some different parts of chapter 7 through 9, that we'll see some of those themes really begin to be nailed down and emphasized and talked about, as well as God's standard of righteousness being applied to Israel and his heart for redemption there as well. Amos gets a bad rap sometimes as just the angry prophet because so much of this is about judgment and about their disobedience. But we see, even as we're going to go, that he also has a heart for redemption and restoration, that this isn't just about tearing the whole thing down, but also about what gets built up in its place. So let me see here. I'll read Amos chapter 7. I just want to read verses 1 through 9, which are this set, and Amos 7 begins this set of visions that Amos has that are given to him by the Lord. And we're going to talk a little bit about what these mean. But in Amos 7, verse 1, it says, "This is what the sovereign Lord showed me. He was preparing swarms of locusts after the king's share had been harvested, and just as the late crops were coming up. When they had stripped the land clean, I cried out, 'Sovereign Lord, forgive. How can Jacob survive? He is so small.' So the Lord relented. 'This will not happen,' the Lord said. This is what the sovereign Lord showed me. The sovereign Lord was calling for judgment by fire. It dried up the great deep and devoured the land. Then I cried out, 'Sovereign Lord, I beg you, stop. How can Jacob survive? He is so small.' So the Lord relented. 'This will not happen either,' the sovereign Lord said. This is what he showed me. The Lord was standing by a wall that had been built true to a plumb, with a plumb line in his hand. And the Lord asked me, 'What do you see, Amos?' 'A plumb line,' I replied. Then the Lord said, 'Look, I am setting a plumb line among my people Israel. I will spare them no longer. The high places of Isaac will be destroyed, and the sanctuaries of Israel will be ruined. With my sword, I will rise against the house of Jeroboam.'" So in these opening verses of chapter 7, these opening visions of Amos's prophecy, we haven't had any visions really to this point. Amos is horrified at these images of judgment that he hears. And you have this really easy to identify with cry out to God of just, please stop. How in the world is Israel ever going to survive what goes on here? And what is God's response as Amos cries out?
Shall not be.
Yeah. It says, okay. He says, I won't do this. I'll relent from this. This won't come to pass. God, essentially, whether God is changing his mind or only showing Amos these visions of what could be, and then saying, but that's not what's going to happen. You see what could go on.
Well, even though he does eventually come against them, he doesn't completely destroy him, though, is the thing.
Yeah.
He never completely destroys Israel.
Yeah.
Oh, well, yeah, no, never completely. But
and that's going to be something that we see, because these first images, you see that the pictures, there's this vision of locusts where after the king's share has been harvested and the late crops are coming, which would be for the people to be harvesting, that's when these locusts come.
Yeah.
And so that's a bad enough judgment that causes Amos to cry out. But the second one isn't exactly a relenting from the severity of, okay, I won't do that, let me do something lesser. Now it's a fire that devours the entire land. Forget one part of the crop being saved. Now it's everything's gone. And Amos is crying out again, like, well, please don't do this instead. This is even worse. How could Jacob ever survive this? How could Israel stand up against it? But this third vision of the plumb line that you get here, Amos doesn't contest this judgment, that God is setting a plumb line among his people and he'll spare them no longer. What do you think what is the significance of this plumb line image that Amos sees and that God promises here as the agreed upon judgment for Israel?
Chief cornerstone.
The chief cornerstone. Explain, what do you mean?
Oh, well, the plumb line is used to set up the edge of the wall. So he's saying that there's the foundations can be set, the plumb lines can be straight and true. There's something coming.
In other words, this is established kind of thing. Like this is going to happen.
It's really interesting because, like you're mentioning, which I think is helpful for a lot of us that don't necessarily build, and you'd say, I know what a plumb line is, but it's practicality other than making sure you have a straight, you know, you're perfect with the ground and with gravity here.
Corners true, corner square.
And it's something used for constructing. It's something that you need in order to build something good. But the language that is used right after this plumb line is set is language of tearing down, right? The high places of Isaac will be destroyed. The sanctuaries will be ruined. And so you have this setting this standard, and this is what it should be. Like you said, setting that corner, making sure it's just right. And then right when you would expect language of building, and upon this I will build something new, it's all this old needs to go. And I think we're going to see that as a theme, especially when we get in Amos 9, that something has to go so that something new can come. And that's going on. What'd you have, Michael?
Well, with that also makes it really interesting, the fact that here Amos does not ask God to run. He doesn't say here that how, like, oh, please cease. Right? I think that's an interesting detail.
Yeah.
I was just going to add, and this also seems a little bit worse than the other two, because this is, you know, the fire and then or famine, but this one comes right against the house of Jeroboam with the sword. As in, death is coming.
You're going to be conquered.
Which,
I mean, we know, and there's a reason why Amos is included in Old Testament canon in the book of the prophets, and because they know 40 years after he said this, Jeroboam's line was wiped out by the Assyrians. So there's this, you know, Amos called it. When looking back, they recognized, he tried to warn us and we didn't listen.
Like he was a true prophet.
And I think it's true because he doesn't stand up against this judgment, in part because it's not a judgment of God's wrath being inflicted on the people. It's a judgment of God's standard being applied to them. This plumb line sets, this is what is expected. This is my truth. Just like we saw it in Amos 1 and 2 with these oracles against the nations. And then once everybody agrees, yes, that is a good standard by which to measure, then he points at Israel and says, and you too are subject to that standard. That's the plumb line that's kind of being drawn here of his word, his law, his command, his righteousness and expectation isn't something that we can wiggle around and find our way around and still build something strong. It'll need to be torn down so that something true and lasting can be built in its place here.
Rebuild.
Yeah, exactly. It has to be rebuilt.
That's what Babylon's for, is to show them punishment for all the years of not giving the Lord the Sabbath or the Jubilee, the 7-year rest, or seventh year rest of the land. I think that was what Jeremiah said was why they were being taken to Babylon. So that's, I think, in Babylon was where the plumb line begins to drop. And it brings back to repentant people when they go back into the land. They're definitely like, all right, we got to do this right. God. And they start rebuilding the temple, we start rebuilding the walls.
There's that whole renewed focus on we have to do this right because we've seen what happens when we don't. we know that it's not just due to us here, you know? And so you have that, absolutely. And it is interesting because we brought up in these as they go, there's these slightly different aspects of the judgment.
Right.
Yeah.
I was about to point out one more thing.
Yeah,
It seems
please.
like the first two, the Lord shows him, and then he sees that, and then he's like, "Oh, please no." But on the last one, yeah, right. And then, but on the last one, God shows him, but then he asks him, "What do you see?"
Yeah.
The plumb line. I am going to this and this and this.
Mhm.
This is coming.
Yeah.
You know, it was different, and it was more in the line of this is established. This is going to happen. You know, it's done.
Yeah.
This one's set.
God might relent, and I think God does relent from
Right.
wrath or anger
Mhm.
against sin, but he doesn't relent from having a standard that he upholds his people
Oh
to.
yeah, right.
And I think
Right.
that's part
Yeah.
of this this
Right.
one isn't up for debate, Amos.
Mhm.
Like, I'm not showing you something so you can cry out against it. I'm giving
Mhm.
you a promise that my standard will be applied to my people.
Mhm.
And that's part of where this goes. But because that first one spared the king, right? After the king's stores are harvested,
Right.
and then that second vision takes out everybody equally. The third one kind of singles out the king.
Right.
With my
Yeah.
sword, I
Yeah.
will rise against the house of Jeroboam. And right after that, it's not a mistake that
Yeah.
then, after that
Mhm.
vision, that oracle, and that prophecy,
Yeah.
you get in the following verse that Amaziah, the priest of Bethel, the chief priest of this religious place in Israel, sends a message to Jeroboam saying, Amos is raising a conspiracy against you.
Mhm.
Essentially, Amos's followers record this story of, and right after he started actually speaking out against Jeroboam, now the entire religious authority and the leadership start hammering down on him, saying, see, Amos is trying to be a rabble rouser. He's conspiring against you.
Yeah.
He's promising ill will toward you and saying that God hates you. And all of this kind of bubbles up to a head
It
here.
seems to happen a lot. Happened to Samuel, happened to Elijah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
You see, God's prophets are often kept at arm's length once they have something true to say to the
Well,
power.
that's
that
right.
is.
But it's interesting. It's very,
Yeah.
it's very similar wording to what you just said though too. Like what they're like, you know, he like what is it? He says one of the kings, he was king when Elijah was around. He says, you know, you
Yep.
yeah. He said, you the troubler of Israel.
Yeah.
And he's like, you're the troubler of Israel.
Actually.
Michael, will you read verse
Reverse
12 in Amos 7? Because this is the message that Amaziah brings back to Amos to try to tell him what he thinks.
Okay. And Amaziah said to Amos, O seer, go flee away from the land of Judah, and eat bread there, and prophesy there, but never again prophesy at Bethel, for it is the king's sanctuary, and it is a temple of the kingdom.
Perfect. Right there. I just want that message from Amaziah as he judges Amos. Get out of here, you seer. Go back to Judah, where you come from. Go make your bread and do all your prophesying there. Get out of our town, because this is the king's sanctuary and the temple of the kingdom.
Mhm.
What I want to ask is, what's wrong with Amaziah's attitude
He
here?
forgot his place.
He forgot his place. How so?
Well, the only reason that he's put there is because God set them up to, you know, the leaders in the positions that they're in. Plus, it's like the only reason that they have what they have is because of God taking care of them. And then he's like, this is my kingdom.
Yeah.
This is my stuff. And he's like, I don't want to, you're ruining my stuff. You're ruining my reputation. You're ruining everything. Just go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For sure. How about anybody online? Y'all are being way too quiet over there, letting Mike and Maston and Aaron carry it for you here.
Yeah.
What's going on with Amaziah's attitude here?
Oh, Grandpa's jumping in.
Froze. It's
Uh-oh.
muted.
He's trying.
Oh no, it is froze.
Literally,
he's trying to figure out.
Everybody's muted right now.
As soon as
I know.
he's
I'm gonna start rolling a die and then just randomly unmuting people and demanding answers.
Oh no, he's moving.
Well, he thought it was his because he says this is a royal shrine. You know,
Yeah.
he thought he had totally come 180 and he wasn't in the loop.
Yeah.
But it's
What's that?
joyful. but it's joyful to listen to these young people and what they say. I have to say that. So
They're just so caught up
Was
around this table. Michael, or Mike, what do you got?
well, I just wondered, was Amaziah, so he's a priest of Bethel. Was he one of God's priests, or was he a priest of other gods?
No, he's a Jewish priest.
Right? But Bethel's not supposed to have a temple.
Oh,
Yeah.
Well, good point.
Yeah, so this is
Oh my
where you
gosh,
get
I
into
didn't
this
think about that.
syncretistic worship of, it's worshiping Yahweh, but it's incorporating all of these pagan and other religious imagery and other gods and other symbols, because we know Bethel had a golden calf that they worshiped at, just like Aaron at Mount Sinai, saying, well, this is the Lord, we can come here and worship. So it's outside of the temple structure in Jerusalem, but he would consider himself a priest of Yahweh, but he might be a priest of Yahweh and part of Asherah's cult and part of this and that and all these other practices.
Right.
and
Basically,
another-
he thinks so, but isn't really.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Another thing I'm saying is he's presupposing that Amos is a heretic,
Mhm.
because I look at the term that he uses when he what is your seer, right?
Yeah, get
He
out
calls
and
him a
seer.
seer,
Yeah,
someone
He didn't
who
call
has
him a prophet.
visions or whatever.
Yeah.
So he's like calling him like, oh, you're not of God
mhm.
or anything like that.
No, that's actually not the name for a prophet.
Oh, is it really?
Yeah.
So he
Yeah, you read
Okay.
First Samuel and it says that in this day that they're, they're called seers and then brothers of kings.
Oh, is that this?
Yeah.
Is
Yeah,
that
but
the
they're
term?
called seers and then they become called prophets later on.
Oh, okay.
Right. Well, actually, going along with what you say, there's a footnote here in my Bible. I think it goes along with what both of you are saying. Actually, it says,
Yeah,
when Amaziah called Amos a seer, his intent may have been to show contempt. The term suggests what was true, that Amos is not a member of the royal guild of prophets,
mhm.
who, since they were paid by the king, would only say what the king wanted to hear.
Mhm.
So basically, he's saying like he's all pretty much being your seer, but you're not a prophet yet.
Yeah.
Oh,
And then
That elevates.
Yeah.
and it would make sense with his response where he says, I'm not a prophet or the son of a prophet. I'm not part of your structure. I'm not part of your system here. But I think we've nailed it just in talking about the issues with Amaziah here. This is the king's sanctuary and a temple of the kingdom. No, it is God's sanctuary.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, and that's where you see when when the religious practices become entwined with the political structure, the politics always over encompasses God. And that's what it becomes here, because it becomes the religion that supports and upholds the kingdom, not we're worshiping God, we know this is his kingdom. We say this is the king's kingdom, and our job is to prop him up. Our job is to support him. And like you said, say the things that the king wants to hear. Make sure that you prophesy positive things during this kingdom, because it becomes a political tool, not true worship and true prophecy of bringing God's truth to his people.
Right.
Right.
It's already you can. Okay, I was just gonna say already in just those two verses alone, you can see the necessity of like why God is doing what he's doing. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like, dang.
Yeah,
You've already reached this level.
you bring something negative, get out and do that somewhere else.
Uh-huh.
This is the king's town.
Mm-hmm.
Go home and eat bread.
Yeah.
Call me bread.
Go there and eat bread.
I think it's easy for us to see some of the issues of this when the people of God or the church, if we want to call this the church, the worshipers of God and the religious structure,
Right.
when it becomes aligned with political power, it loses its guts to speak truth to that power, because it's deriving its legitimacy from the political structure. And we live, I think it is an understatement to say, in a politically charged and a politically polarized world.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we keep ourselves from becoming so closely aligned to one party, one structure, one tribe, that we become incapable or unwilling to speak God's truth to that party or tribe or group? Like, how do we navigate that in our own world here?
Checks and balances.
Checks and balances.
We have to stick to the biblical truths of
Mhm.
God's standard, not ours.
Yeah.
First off, and then almost at some point, you know, maybe churches are also gonna have to, because I'll say like the government can possibly influence churches down the road, and maybe at some point the churches just are gonna have to drift away from 501c3 status. You know, if they start telling us what we can or can't say, you know, and say, no, you can't say that or this, we're gonna have to go like, no, we're gonna stick to God's word.
Yeah.
You know, maybe our tax income status isn't worth it.
Yeah.
You know, because we have to stick to God's standard, not ours, and not anybody, any political
Or any other
affiliations. Or,
Yeah.
Right.
You know,
Yeah, because this is above all of that.
This is the plumb line right
This-
here.
yeah, this is the plumb line. Yes.
How dare you steal my notes? We measure with God's plumb line and not the world.
I
Yes.
read it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's a huge part when we think about how do we live within this world that is so charged, is we have to recognize whatever group that we naturally affiliate with, or we, by the majority of our belief, our conviction, we tend to have alliances with this group or that group. It might be Republican, it might be nonpartisan or independent or this thing or that thing or Democrat or whatever. And then we have to be able to say, whatever that is and however closely I affiliate with the structures or the opinions of this or that, I can't stop measuring by this standard and speaking even prophetic truth to my own people that I like. And I think sometimes the church struggles in that because we want to be like Amaziah and apologize for the leaders we like and make the excuses and the statements, and they're like, well, you don't understand, or well, they did it worse, or da da da. And it's like, that's a crooked plumb line to say that person did it worse, so I'm straight enough. Because that's not God's plumb line. That's the good enough for a government job plumb line of, well, there's worse ones out there, so it's cool. And we have to have that to be able to say it, you know?
It's, well, and like thinking about, you know, it's the way it is with people is like, you know, look at our last two Republican and Democrat presidents. Like it would, or any of them throughout history for the most part, you know?
Yeah.
Like it would be silly for us to be like, this guy did everything right, everything according to us. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right. But like, that would be silly because it's like, you know, Donald Trump didn't do that, and Joe Biden didn't do that, neither of them.
Yeah.
You know, and we have to recognize these are political powers outside of the church. These aren't people who we're going to be like, they're just upholding God's standard.
Yeah.
They're not. They're not.
Yeah. That's expecting that or wanting that is the church abdicating a responsibility that it has been called to maintain, which is the responsibility of Amos, to be the prophets in the world who speak God's truth to power and hold the world to a standard and a plumb line that sometimes it is going to chafe against. And sometimes, like what happens with Amos, the church will be persecuted, belittled, mocked, or made lesser in the world. Like you mentioned, there's financial penalties for this and that, or whatever it might be, but to say God's truth is our standard, and that's what we are going to hold to. God's command for righteousness and justice and equality and these works that are there, that's the measure that we are going to measure our world in. And that means we're going to throw stones at everybody's glass house, sometimes including our own, and saying we have to do better. And that's, I think, a really challenging word from Amos, because if we read this and just think that it's talking about those people, then we've missed the point, because he came to try to drive the nail as home as he could for his hearer, not to convince them that it was the other people who were wrong as they went. So to kind of move forward here, does anybody have anything else that you might want to say or jump in on this with? Darla, hold on. You're muted up. I just clicked to unmute you. Darla, you're muted. There we go.
I'm old. I've been around a long time. I have done research with problem solving so much for so long, and have always been in a Christian family and church situation. And I do not believe that I have seen in my life the divisions that we have today between the two political parties and the unwillingness to be ever to be always critical. And that is so upsetting to me because it's true that we have not always agreed, but then we have almost always been able to talk and not demean each other. And I think Christ's main focus is love and be understanding, where none of us are going to be perfect and right on everything. And that we need to be able to look at the other person's point of view and at Christ's point of view, and to be able to understand and to listen to each other. And in any good marriage, a good marriage, you don't get everything you want, but you have to communicate well with each other and each give. And if we're giving with a thought of love and Christ's focus of what he teaches us, we will have a different world. And we're not headed that way right now. And I think our focus has to be on Christ's love and understanding and listening to each other and not demanding our way only. Sorry, but I'll get on my soapbox anytime and say that. I just, lived long enough to watch so much and deep concern right now. So anyway.
They're going,
Wait.
to their standard to the extreme on either side.
Yeah.
Right. That's, yeah, I was just gonna say, adding to what you were going off of earlier, as far as with people and all that stuff. I went to 1 Corinthians verse 25. The foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men.
Yeah.
In other words, this, because we were talking about this is the standard that we hold to, this is what we lean on, and all that stuff. But when we're dealing with people, when they look at this, and then you go up to 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 18, for the word of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. In other words, you can't make anybody who doesn't want to understand. Who isn't going to hear, they're not going to hear. As far as you need to fix this and this and this. But we who are proclaiming the power of Christ in this world and what is right and good and just, which is right and good and just, or it is the truth, then that is what we'll stand for. And like she was just saying too, when we can communicate that and we can come to some level of understanding, even though they won't, get to the, be saved if they don't want that, they just don't accept it. They can understand that, this is out of love and all those other things, and these are the things that we'll uphold.
Yeah.
Right, that's the thing. It's that core idea that you can, when we talk to each other, even we've been saying, we can be wrong, and when you're talking to another believer at some theological issue and thing, say they could be wrong and you could be right. That's still a possibility, right? And even if they are, though, it is still 100% important to hear people out, understand them, so that you can communicate to them more effectively, and that's how you show love to them. And such.
And Darla.
And quite often, I've learned that even this year with different people's opinions, if we listen to them, their experience makes them why they have that viewpoint for different situations in our world, and they have good reasons for those different viewpoints. And we need to be able to listen to those and weigh them and not be critical, because if we're just so determined our way is right and no one else's way is right, then we are putting up a block and we are eliminating a lot of people's experiences that are very valuable in this world, and in understanding each other and the situations in living in different places. I lived in El Paso, Texas, on the border. I have different opinions, experiences as to what's important for those people, or for things that have happened to these different people. And just as each of us have lived in different places, a lot of it, if we were open to the situations that those people were going through at those different places, it can and help us to stop and think, okay, I don't always know what everyone else's road has been, And I need to listen so that I don't always think I'm right and that they're wrong. There are points for a lot of different situations.
I think a point that I've always tried to hold to, and I try to counsel people, especially when it comes to heated conversations or heated discussions and debates, is to not listen to respond, but to listen to understand and comprehend. To listen to somebody talking and not be listening for that bullet point like it's a debate where you say, I'm going to hit them on this as soon as they take a breath. I know what my point's going to be. Because if we sit and listen and say, I want to be able to understand this the way you do, like I want to be able to restate it and you say, yeah, that's the thing I think.
Yeah.
Then even if I still disagree, I know it better. And it's a way that we don't just preach God's truth and God's character, but we model God's truth and God's character, which I think is just as important, because we can see in our world the effect of preaching God's righteousness without practicing it, and it turns into self-righteousness and hypocrisy. But if we preach God's standard while holding ourselves to it, to say, I have to be ready to give an account for the hope that's in me, but I have to be able to do it with gentleness and respect, because that's the second half of that verse.
And also saying, hey, like, I was broken before I came to Christ too, and all this other stuff. Like, we will go through this together. Kind of thing. That's another thing that I feel like isn't seen often or as much anymore. It's the fact that, like, we will go through this process. I'm not just going to tell you that what you're doing is wrong. I'll help you, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Like, let's do this together.
Exactly. So
and while you're taking a breath, Mike, I would just like to say, I would just like to say amen to what everything Darla said, and that you said. It is so important to listen to really understand, not listen to get your point across.
Yeah.
And I just thought that was very well said.
Absolutely. I'm going to give Darla the mic on a Sunday here and let you share it, because I think it is a worthy word that needs to be heard by more people. 100%.
I thought you expressed it well, Mike, with your idea of that listen to listen, not to make our own point. And so we all fail to do that sometimes. I mean, I've been guilty of that, but at the same time, it's a good discussion. But open, both sides listening.
When I was in high school class that referred to it as springboarding, when you listen to somebody and you're ready to springboard off something they said into your own thing. And so I always think of that class, and I'm probably more guilty than anyone else at the table, because I'm a preacher. I like to hear my own voice. I can just kind of go on anything for any amount of time. My voice is an accordion. It can fill the space.
Who doesn't like to be right, though?
Yeah, exactly.
That's the problem. It's human nature.
You're right, Mike. Having grown up as a preacher's daughter, yes, I heard my dad's voice a lot, and it is very common. That's why I said, while you're breathing there, Mike, I'm going to say amen.
And now back into it. Yeah.
Right. It's part of our corrupted nature that we just want to impose ourselves on others, and we want to be right all the time about everything. We even show it when, like, say there's a biblical concept we're supposed to be following and we're not doing it, and somebody comes up to you with it, you still want to be right.
Yeah.
So you try to find a way to weasel out of it sometimes. That can happen.
Oh, everybody's had experience with somebody who was like that, I'm sure. Even we've done that from time to time.
I was going to say,
with somebody.
With somebody in the But I think this is good, and I want us to keep looking, because there's this one vision, this vision of the plumb line and these visions that are there. And then in Amos 8, you get the following vision, which it really shouldn't be broken off how it is, because these visions all kind of tie into each other. And you get God, instead of showing him a plumb line, he shows him a basket of ripe fruit. And when he says, all right, well, what do you see? Well, it's a bunch of ripe fruit. And then God's response is in verse 2, the time is ripe for my people Israel. I will spare them no longer, which I love, because that feels like such a cheesy object lesson to say, yes, it is ripe fruit. And their time is ripe as well. That the songs in the temple will turn to wailing, and that bodies will be flung everywhere, and there will be silence. And so you have this the time is right for God's people to be judged. And then in verse 4, you get an explanation of what they're being judged for, and it gets explained more. Hear this, you who trample the needy and do away with the poor in the land. It's their inequality and their injustice to the poor and to the marginalized. Even though they are guilty of idolatry and they're guilty of these things, God's main statement about their sin is that they're being unjust and unloving to the poor among them.
He hates partiality.
He hates it.
He
Like,
hates partiality.
if God chooses favorites, he chooses from the margins, not the center. You know what I mean? In theology, it's referred to as God's preferential option of the poor. Like that if God has to choose in any of these situations, he's choosing those who are without, the have-nots as opposed to the haves. And you see it spelled out in verse 5 and 6 here. When will the new moon, this is what the people say, those that are committing injustice. They're saying, when will the new moon be over that we may sell grain, and the Sabbath ended that we may market wheat, skimping on the measure, boosting the price, and cheating with dishonest scales. That's the judgment, is you aren't measuring out fair portions. You're overcharging and under delivering. You're robbing the poor because they have no other option.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
You're taking advantage of their situation.
Which,
and
if
just
that
keeping
does
them
not
there and
cause
not
us to
helping.
pause in our American society, then we have misread this verse.
That's exactly what I'm thinking.
Yeah.
What's going on nowadays?
Yeah. Exactly, where we see our own world, like this isn't a problem that just existed 20
What is happening?
Yeah, I don't know what's going on.
We're not hearing you at all, Pastor. We're just getting some kind of
Use that little mouse and do something.
There is some kind of interference. I wonder if there's someone out there that disagrees with us.
It's just saying 20 book, 20 book, 20 book, 20 book, 20 book.
Maybe the online people are going to have to sign off and let them go ahead and finish the discussion because it's online something, right?
Okay.